This is a quick timeline of my history as a game developer. I worked on small teams, large teams, and all by myself. I've created 17 mobile games as a solo developer, and most of those were self-published. A bunch of icons are probably a terrible way of showing games, so here are a few games I'll be talking about today. Here. Okay, so in the middle of last year, my work at Revival Productions was coming to an end. I had stopped Radiangames for about 3 years to work on a spiritual successor to Descent. I knew I wanted to go back to Radiangames full-time, but I wasn't sure if I could still make a living doing paid games on mobile like I had in 2014. When I was looking through my previous games analytics on the App Store, something stood out. This last column over here, that's the sessions that players have played the game in the last year. And Inferno 2, my best-selling game by a large amount, is actually played 3 times less than SLYDRIS, which is down near the bottom. SLYDRIS is an infinite puzzle game, similar to Tetris in a few ways. I wanted to make a sequel, and it seemed like a good idea to make SLYDRIS 2 a free game. So I studied lots of free games and watched lots of videos about how to make free-to-play games. I'll come back to how that worked out for SLYDRIS 2 later. But let's step back for a second and ask why I chose mobile games over other platforms. Actually, the reason is simple. Touch Arcade and Pocket Gamer consistently cover my games, and Apple gives them minor features. I spent a long time working on Overload with the guys at Revival. It's an awesome game, but very few people knew about the game, and the sales reflect that. It reminded me how hard it is to get attention, and that I should take whatever attention I can get. And just for reference, the mobile version of Inferno 2 has sold about 50 times better than the PC version. When people talk about discoverability, they often mention reaching out to content creators and building a community, but not me. I don't like spending time talking to people. I'm sure there are other things that are worth doing on a game that takes a month. I'm not sure these things are worth doing on a game that takes a month or two. If you make free-to-play games, you need to make a good game, and you need to do a lot more stuff on top of that. This is just the ASO side of things. You need to think about the icon, the title, the screenshots, the description, the video. You can optimize those things. This is stuff I don't want to do. I don't want to spend time doing anything, really, besides making a game. So I just do a good first pass, and I don't spend any time refining. But if you want to do well with free games, you should be doing this stuff. So if I don't like spending time on major aspects of making my game successful, why am I up here? My goal is not to make the most amount of money possible with my games. My goal is to make as many good games as I can before I die. Like, that's my goal in life. That's my bucket list, is to make lots of good games. So I've made that the core of my strategy. Like, I basically say, if I make lots of games that are decent, people will follow me, and then they'll buy more of my games, and I can keep making games. So first, I create lots of small titles quickly. I have lots of experience. I'm able to focus. I'm impatient. The next game is always appealing to me. That's the fun part of game development, is working on the games. Then I create all the stuff that I don't enjoy doing, though I do enjoy making trailers, more or less, except for the capturing the footage part. Then around launch, I email about a dozen press people and do some social media posts. And I usually contain this to a dozen people because those are the people who consistently cover my games. I usually spend about a day promoting the game when it's about to launch. And the days after the launch, I usually update the game to deal with feedback and refine it based on reviews, and then I move on as fast as possible. I'm usually excited to work on something new. In fact, I've probably worked on the next game for a week by the time the previous one is released. This cycle does not include contacting people at the App Store or Google Play. I've never talked to those people. But obviously they see the games on Touch Arcade and Pocket Gamer because I would say like 15 of the 17 games I've released on the App Store have been featured. The only forums I use are Touch Arcades. I just respond to the people there because they like my games. And then I also do a weekly blog post, but it's more for me than anyone else because it just helps me sort out my thoughts. And this is what happens when I get into a good cycle. This is the sales chart from my iPhone releases in 2014. It's not very impressive, but keep in mind that the Android versions were adding a decent multiplier on top. I didn't realize it at the time, but I averaged $10,000 a month between these 4 releases on those 2 platforms. And my next game was Inferno 2, which outsold all these games combined. Stopping to do another interesting project is one way to screw up the cycle, and that's what happened with Inferno 2. But there are other ways to do it. You can also do your trailer too early, and you end up making a second one, like I did with Scorcher. You get too ambitious, and you end up with an alpha trailer early on, and then nothing close to a finished game, like Gigatron, because I ran out of money. Or you can usually end up doing too much at once, and it's hard to finish something when you're doing multiple things at once. I can usually handle 2 projects at once, one that's starting and one that's finishing, but I can't handle more than that. I have trouble. So keep in mind that I make arcadey action and puzzle games. My deeper and more relaxed action games have actually sold better, but that usually involves more complexity and a longer dev cycle. Many other genres are actually better suited to paid games for small developers, such as adventure games, role-playing games, and other story-based experiences. I'm not against doing larger games, but all my games have either been less than 2 months or more than 10 months. Something in between is probably the sweet spot for me, and I'll try to aim for that in the future. Now, everyone knows that free games are winning the battle for market share, and paid games are going extinct. This graph is from 3 years ago. It's 92 to 8%, and it's only gotten farther than that since then. Very few developers are making only paid games on mobile, and the main reason, these are screen caps of today's top charts with the grossing chart on the right. Minecraft is the top-selling paid game, and it's ranked number 62 in the grossing chart. The next game after Minecraft is ranked number 224. And this chart doesn't measure ad revenue, just in-app purchases. So there's plenty of ad-based games that are way above Bloom's TD6. There's no question paid games are a bad idea if you're trying to make a lot of money. If that's your only goal, you should make free games, and I'll get back to that. Let's see how paid games have done for Radiangames over the past 7 years. Inferno Plus is the 3rd game I launched as Radiangames and my most successful of 2012. It got some press coverage, but no Apple feature that I can remember. It wasn't a significant launch, but it's had a pretty long tail because it's a pretty good game. After moderate success in 2012, converting 4 games to iOS, I spent about 10 months on a larger game called Bombcats. It was a huge disaster, and the most stress I felt as a developer in my life. It's still painful to talk about, to be honest, but just search my blog if you want to learn more. Let's move on. After Bombcat's failure, Crush was a desperate attempt to get some money back while I also worked on Android ports of all my games. It was a pretty simple game, so I tried launching it at 99 cents to see if maybe 99-cent games were better for me, because all my previous games had been $1.99. It was my 5th solo release, and I still couldn't break the top 200 in the paid game sales charts. The Android ports ended up doing pretty well, and I signed a contract to work on a game with Cartoon Network, so Radiangames was able to continue despite Bombcat's failure. After the Powerpuff Girls game, which was another 10-month project like Bombcats, I went back to smaller games. Joy Joy was the 2nd release in 2014, and probably the start of what I would call the golden era of Radiangames releases. I got the usual amount of coverage and some actual good featuring by Apple for the first time. It had a solid launch week, and my first game to break the top 200 in the paid sales games charts. Fluid came the month after with pretty consistent results. June had fewer game releases that year, so even though it sold less, Fluid got a higher ranking on the charts. I'm going to tie all these rankings together at the end, so you'll see why I'm covering that. Super CROSSFIGHTER, same year, another month later, also got good coverage. It was a remaster of a game I did 3 years before that, but it still got featured by Apple and had a sales spike the week after because it was released a little bit in a weird time. It had my best US sales day so far thanks to that feature, and it broke the top 100. Then came Inferno 2, and I finally had my first hit game. It got the number 3 slot on the new games list, the highest of all my games. Notice that it took over 1,000 sales to reach number 44 on the the top rankings. In September of the next year, I launched Devastator. It got a good feature by Apple, though not quite as good as Inferno 2. Notice that it reached almost the same paid game sales rank with under half the number of sales. We can start to see the effect of fewer paid games being released because this game sold way less than Inferno 2, almost got the same ranking. The sales, of course, dropped off a cliff because this game was way too hard at launch. But it also only took 5 weeks to make, so why did it launch 11 months after Inferno 2? Well, I started working on Overload before I knew how successful Inferno 2 was going to be. I was a huge Descent fan and had worked on Descent 3, so it was a very cool opportunity to work on Overload, a spiritual successor. The next year after Inferno 2 was pretty messy in terms of development and was probably my least productive since I started Radiangames. After Devastator, I went back to Overload with more people helping out, and Revival decided to do a Kickstarter. This was 2 years after Kickstarter had peaked. These pics are from the Overload Kickstarter campaign when we decided not to shave until we made it. It was the second most stressful time in my life as a developer, and we only made it with 2 hours remaining, and it was not worth it, I have to say. Like, we promised so much stuff from the Kickstarter that we ended up taking like a year longer than it would have taken to make the game otherwise. And that year cost way more than what the Kickstarter made. On the positive side, Descent fans loved the game, and I learned a lot about Unity and became a better programmer because of Overload. So getting back to paid games, we now fast forward to my first paid release since Devastator. This game released 2 weeks ago, and I have to admit I was a bit worried that it wouldn't make it out in time for this talk. It looks like a normal launch sales curve to me, except for a bigger than usual Saturday spike thanks to an extra feature on that day. It's doing about as well as I expected, to be honest. The game stands out visually, but it's also score-focused, and score-focused games don't sell that well in my experience. They're just a little too hardcore for most people, and it doesn't have quite the same appeal to a broad audience. It has significantly fewer sales than Inferno 2, but a much better chart ranking, and this is 4.5 years after Inferno 2 launched. So let's look back at a bunch of numbers to see how many downloads it takes to get a certain slot in the top paid charts. If you look at the early years versus 2019, you can see it takes a lot fewer downloads to get into the top. Like number 25 is 664 downloads, and I bet in 2013 that would have been like rank 100. So this chart kind of graphs the approximate sales to chart ranking. It used to take over 200 downloads to get into the top 200 games in 2013. And now if you get 200 downloads, you'll be in the top 80. The top yellow line shows how many downloads you need to get to reach the top 50, and that's down below, it's around 300 games now, 300 downloads a day. So why are the top games selling less? Because people are making less of them. Everyone is making free games, and not many are making paid games. Because there are more free games, and many more of them are good, many people are less willing to pay for paid games. To be honest, it's hard to judge based on one game released this year, and I need to release more to make any definite conclusions. But I don't think paid games are dead, they're just neglected. Now let's look at a comparable free game which released 4 months ago. This is SLYDRIS 2's launch, which got a similar level of coverage and featuring as Scorcher. The overall revenue is actually very similar to Scorcher's for the first 5 weeks, just a bit more smoothed out. Notice that it was getting around 6,000 downloads a day, but never broke the top 200 in free games. When I said the games had a similar level of featuring, I wasn't underselling it. They literally had the same slot in the new games list. And usually I found that the slot on the new games list directly corresponds to how many downloads I'll get for my game, regardless of quality. I'm not sure if Apple meant to give them the same slot, but it sure makes for a nice comparison. The games are different, and I'd still expect a reasonably similar sales between the two. So let's compare more directly. These are the first week downloads in the US only with the same featured slot. SLYDRIS 2 released at a better time of year in late November, but Scorcher had a better bonus feature. I'm not sure this ratio is totally accurate, but it feels about right to me. And for lower price games, the ratio will be a bit closer than 20-to-1. The important thing, aside from the ratio, is where the games ended up on the charts. There are just a lot more free games getting tons of downloads, so it's a lot harder to get onto the top charts there. Long term, SLYDRIS 2 has continued to do pretty well. For people who figure out the game, it's very satisfying and enjoyable to play. It was my first game to get a significant Apple feature beyond a good launch slot. It got Game of the Day in the US in January, a bunch of other countries in February, and then China in March. It was like getting 3 extra launches for the game. The best revenue day was actually from the China feature, mostly due to ads. So here's the total stats for SLYDRIS 2 up until last week. Given the quality of the game and the downloads, these revenue numbers actually seem pretty low. The reason is the retention and ad revenue numbers aren't good enough for a game of this quality. I'm happy with the downloads and overall results, but I've been lucky. And those numbers up here, especially the ones at the bottom, they could be even worse, and I'll show you why. This is pivotal. This was Touch Arcade's Game of the week it came out. It's not a bad game. It was featured in the New Games We Love list, and it got quite a few downloads the first week, but it was just a little too hard for people to figure out, for lots of people to figure out, and not quite as good as SLYDRIS 2. This is what happens when you don't really know how to make a free game. If it had been paid, I would estimate it would have made 3 times as much, if not more, than this amount. So making free games is harder than paid games in a few ways. You have to be more hardcore about ease of use issues, and refining the UI flow, and keeping things simple. This is the easy stuff, the stuff as a developer that you can handle. It requires a shift in mentality, but it's not painful. Now we're getting to the more painful stuff. Doing a free game means you have to think about ads, or in-app purchases, or both. You'll feel more constraints on the genre and the expected complexity of your game. The game's systems will be warped to fit the need to retain users and generate revenue. Ad-based games need to be simple and easy to get into, and in-app purchase games need to be deep and content-heavy. You also need to be obsessive with your stat tracking. This page right there, it updates in real time. You can see every dot pop up for every time someone installs your game or starts your game. And it's not good for your mentality. I looked at this page multiple times, especially when SLYDRIS 2 launched. I was like, I can't do this. I can't handle this as a solo developer. So after launch, you'll get emailed by lots of ad companies offering to boost your revenue, saying you're not making enough money. Do you use multiple companies, or do you stick with one for simplicity? How much do you negotiate? How much time is required to set up all this stuff to make them negotiate with each other in real time? Then there are the reviews. Some negative reviews provide critical info about a bug or issue, but many others are not as fun to read, and they might be useful, so you have to suck it up and just read them anyway. And all that ASO and UA stuff that I mentioned before, that needs to be done too. Making free games is overwhelming, and I have a simple recommendation if you want to do them. If you don't enjoy obsessing over optimization and stats, get someone to help you. It could be a partner, a publisher, a co-developer, or a consultant. If you're doing free games, I'd almost say this is a requirement. Let someone else who knows what they're doing handle the stuff that sucks. You'll have to share some of the money, but there will probably be a lot more of it. This is what it feels like to make a paid game in 2019. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you have to go into it with the proper expectations. There are still some players who will love and prefer paid games. There are lots of them on Touch Arcade. And you'll probably be able to make more of these games if that's important to you. And comparing these two games, SLYDRIS and Scorcher had similar featuring and revenue numbers in the first few weeks. It's still too early to tell what the long-term sales will be, and SLYDRIS 2 has had lots of help after those first 5 weeks. But working on Scorcher was more enjoyable, and the launch was way less stressful. And I would have enjoyed working on SLYDRIS 2 more if it were paid and made the same amount of money. I don't like that nagging feeling that I need to keep working on a game. I like finishing things and feel good about finishing things and moving on to the next thing. And I'm always excited about the new game that's coming up, more game ideas. I finally get to work on this thing. So if you're doing paid games, you probably need to get an Apple feature to be successful. That's not new. That's been true for 8 years, probably. You'll also have a lower cap on the revenue you make, but you might enjoy working on the game more. There are fewer paid games, but I don't think the good ones are necessarily selling less. There's just a lot fewer of them. On the other hand, I studied free games for many months before doing Pivotal on SLYDRIS 2, and I still sucked at it. It takes a certain mentality to do free games well, and it's hard to do by yourself. Get an expert to help you, and you'll be less stressed and probably make a lot more money. I'm not saying this because I have anything to sell. I'm not an expert. But I've talked to other developers and other publishers and other people who do this sort of thing, and I'm like, you guys just know so much more about this than I do, and you actually want to do that stuff, and I don't. And before I end, I have a couple more quick slides. Earlier, I recommended not doing an early trailer, but sometimes it works out. If you have the right game and trailer. I have around 2,000 followers on Twitter, but a tweet with the trailer from Speed Demons, which is this game, got over 12,000 views in the first week. It was the most liked and retweeted thing I've done by a factor of like 5. And it opened up new opportunities for Radiangames. But it was a risk spending that much time on a trailer that early in development. It just happened to work out this time. Let's take a look at some total sales numbers as well, because everybody likes stats. These charts are a few days old, so Scorcher sales are a little bit off. And the free games only show in-app purchases only. I don't know what happened with Google Play this year, but it's been sucking for me. Regardless, my better games have had better long-term sales, and that's pretty encouraging, I think. Because if you look at the top charts, those games have had good reviews in general and have continued to sell pretty well. And when a new game comes out, those are the games that get the bigger boost. And a little while back, someone put together a comparison of first week versus first year sales for a bunch of Steam games. Simon from GDC asked me to do the same thing for my game, so here are 6 games in order of release. The ratios are actually lower than I expected, though the revenue numbers are pretty much what I would expect. The biggest 2 factors in what affects the ratio are the perceived game quality and style of game leads to better long-term sales, and the games with the lower ratios usually had better features in their first week. Even though Devastator at the bottom has the lowest ratio, that's because it got a really good feature, and then people really didn't like the hardcoreness of it after it was no longer featured. So I don't think it's a time thing that affects the ratio. I think the ratio is still the same over time. And that's it. And we're just on time. Perfect. So if you have any questions, there's a microphone right there. And I'm happy to answer any questions now, or if you want to talk outside, that's fine too. All right, we got someone coming.
So I'm curious who you recommend getting help from. Who do you have had partners that you've enjoyed working with, and what do you think?
Who would I recommend? Anybody who does free-to-play games. If you have a good game to show off, you could just you could contact any publisher. There's lots of other small developers who are doing free games and making lots of money. You could contact some of them. I'm not one of those guys, but I've had people contact me. It's not like I haven't really reached out to anyone. People will just, if you get your game featured on Apple, people will just email you. And some of them will actually play your game and then tell you what they like about it and then offer to help you make it better. And I usually don't respond to those things, but some people are more persistent, and sometimes they are obviously another developer who has interest in the game. So that's what really happened with SLYDRIS, is multiple people emailed me about it, and it's like, this game should be doing better. I'm like, okay, sure, tell me how. And so that'll happen eventually, but not right now. Yes?
Since you don't like doing ASO and all that stuff, how discoverability has never been a problem for you?
How would you learn ASO if you've never been a publisher?
No. Since you never liked doing ASO and doing the screenshots and icons and truly doing a lot about them, you always focus on the content of the game. So why discoverability has never been a problem for you?
It's never been a problem because when my first few games weren't actually that successful, but they got the attention of Touch Arcade consistently. Like my first game, Fireball, it hasn't sold that terribly well, but it was a good game, and the people on Touch Arcade's forums liked it, and they would keep talking about it. And then my next game was pretty good, and it got more attention. And so Touch Arcade just kept consistently covering my games because I was consistent in putting out good games, and I did it pretty fast, which most people don't do the games quite as quickly. So because I was able to do the games consistently and fast, I just kept getting coverage, and then eventually Apple started picking up on that and started featuring the games. And so now I have a pretty reliable, I put out the game, I tell TouchArrogate about it, I tell Pocket Gamer. They cover the games, Apple features games, somewhere on the new games we love list, usually not that high, but depends on the game. So it's just been a cycle of putting out lots of quality games to get to the point where people will pay attention to the new games that I put out.
All right.
So I don't really, like, I think I've gotten a little better at the screenshots and like the descriptions and stuff, but I don't really know for sure. Like, doing the trailers, I think, helps because those are actually on the store now. But beyond that, I don't think I'm like that much better than what I did in 2013 or 2014.
Okay, pretty lucky you are. Thank you.
Okay, looks like it. Thanks for coming.